Okay, good morning. So we're looking at other types of signaling molecules today, and that will include plant hormones, neurotransmitters, cytokines. So that's what we're looking at as part of today. Starting off, we're going to look at plant hormones quickly. So the general understanding of plant hormones isn't quite as detailed as the understanding of animal hormones, just in general. That means as well what you might be asking is generally a bit less extensive. You're more likely to get a question on animal hormones, but you can get a question about plant hormones. But just an overview. So plant hormones are used for growth and development of plants in response to environmental stimuli. So it could be things like light, whatever. And I've got a few examples just on this diagram that I'll try and upload just for you to have a look at. So we've got gibberellins that are hormones that promote flowering, and they promote flowering in response to light. Obviously, plants don't want to be opening their flowers up when there's not a big amount of light around. That might mean there aren't many insects around if it's colder. So they want to make sure they're opening at a time where it's good for them to be more likely to get pollinated. Auxin is one of the best understood plant hormones, and it's responsible for cell elongation. So really for the plants growing directionally, and they do that in response to light. So basically, depending on where light is shining on the plant, cells can begin growing in that direction due to auxin, and that causes the plant to grow in a particular way. And that's especially important in allowing the stem to grow towards the light as well. I am going to upload onto Google Classroom a scientific journal entry about auxin. It's probably more degree level than VCE level, so it's completely optional to read. But if you are interested and want to have a look at the sort of articles you may be reading in like first year university, if you go on to do biology at university, have a look at that. So that'll be on Google Classroom focusing on auxin, a plant hormone. So we also have abscisic acid, and what that does is that closes stomata to inhibit growth. If the stomata are closed, carbon dioxide can't enter the plant, and if carbon dioxide can't enter the plant, then photosynthesis can't happen. If photosynthesis can't happen, glucose can't be made, and it can't be used to allow the plant to grow. So that's in response to various environmental stimuli, but temperature is a big one. When it starts cooling down, plants want to reduce their growth. They obviously grow slower over the winter and grow faster over the summer. And then there's those things in the bottom corner, cytokines, which promote cell division by mitosis. You might remember from year 11 biology, mitosis ends in cytokinesis when the cells split. So that's where the name of this comes from. It basically allows plant cells to grow by mitosis, and that's in response to lots of different environmental things. And finally, ethylene gas. And ethylene is useful for promoting the ripening of fruits. And interestingly, that can actually be done artificially. In agriculture, before they send fruits to supermarkets, they'll often expose them to ethylene to make sure they're ripe. You may be aware as well, there's a trick you can do if you've got an avocado and it's not ripe. You can put a banana with it for a day or two, and that will ripen it. That's because bananas produce big amounts of ethylene gas, and that's picked up by the avocado and causes it to ripen. So, like I say, there's not too much to talk about the plant hormones. Just know the general idea that they are used for growing and developing plants, and that's in response to different environmental stimuli. And that's just some names of some of the key ones that are involved. Okay, another type of signaling molecule are pheromones. These are used by animals, and these are signals that are released externally into the environment. So they're usually for communicating with other members of the same species rather than within an individual. So they're used by animals, especially insects, to communicate about food, sex, territory. Humans, the jury's a bit out on whether or not humans actually use pheromones. It's believed that there are a few pheromones that humans use, but they don't really use it in huge quantities like many animals do. And you can see on your slides about this, it shows a deer communicating when it's fertile, and that's done via pheromones. But like I say, insects are where they're really most widely studied. If you think about social insects that live in big colonies like ants, wasps, bees, they've got very, very complex signals that have to be shared amongst themselves. And that's also done by pheromones. Interesting fact about that. Some women have found that particular perfumes they have can make wasps attack them, which is a pretty nasty side effect. And that's due to the perfumes actually imitating, by accident, some of the pheromones that wasps use to indicate attack. So wasps nearby picks up the scent of this perfume, and it's the same chemical signature as when it receives a signal from a wasp saying we need to attack that. So just an interesting fact. Okay, and then on to neurons or nerve cells. So these are the main cells of the nervous system, and they're made to carry and transmit electrical nerve impulses. So these are happening much faster than hormones. They're electrical signals, they move very quickly, and they've got quite a complex structure. So they've got these long protrusions at one end of them called dendrites. So the dendrites are where it picks up signals from another cell. Like most cells, it's got a nucleus as well. And then going along here, it's got the axon, which is transmitting the signal along. And that's surrounded by this myelin sheath. The job of the myelin sheath is to insulate the signal to make sure that it can travel quickly to where it's meant to. The disease multiple sclerosis is caused when the myelin sheath breaks down, and that results in nerve impulses not being able to move as quickly, which can result in tiredness, muscle aches, lack of control over movements. But anyway, when it gets to the far end, the signal moves from axons to dendrites of the next cell. So these little dendrites that I've drawn here, those are basically these on the next cell. And there's a tiny, tiny, tiny gap that we call a synapse that needs to be jumped by the electrical signal. And that's what we're about to look at now. So like I say, the synapse is a gap between two nerve cells. And the signal's got to jump that gap, and it's got to ensure that it only goes in one direction. I'm sure you can imagine if your nerve impulses were trying to jump a gap, but then something went wrong and they went back the other way, your nerves wouldn't be controlled. They'd be going multiple directions. We want nerve impulses to only travel in the correct direction, and the synapse helps ensure that happens. And synapses rely on what we call neurotransmitters to let the signals jump the gaps. And I've just written that there. Neurotransmitters let nerve signals jump the synapse gap and ensure the signals only go in one direction. So I've just put down here, the synapse is the gap between the two nerve cells. This is the presynapse, so where the nerve signal is coming from, and this is the postsynapse, where it is going to. So I've written a couple of things. Unfortunately, I color-coded it and that's not showing up particularly well on video. I will upload a photo of this as well, so you can hopefully see it a bit clearer. So the first thing that happens is there's a nerve impulse coming down here, an electrical signal. So that reaches the presynapse, and as it reaches the presynapse, it causes these calcium channels to open. So the nerve impulse comes down, and then calcium channels open on the presynapse. That causes calcium to move into the presynapse, and all in this presynapse, we've got these little vesicles full of neurotransmitters. Okay, there are lots of different types of neurotransmitters used in the body, but yeah, calcium activates them. The neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, and what they do is they bind with these receptors on the other side. That causes the receptors to open. That allows other positive ions to flood into the postsynapse. and then that allows the signal to carry on going. Okay, so like I say, try and study this image maybe in your own time and have a look at the description in your slides as well. But just to go over that really quickly, the signal travels down the pre-synapse neuron where the signal's coming from. As it reaches here, it causes calcium channels to open. That causes calcium ions to move into the pre-synapse. That causes neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse. Those are picked up by receptors on the far side of the synapse, and they open, they allow other ions to flood in and allow the nerve impulse to keep on travelling. Okay. Now, you may have noticed in your slides, at the end of the last lesson, I had a number of song lyrics about drug addiction, mostly heroin addiction. So there was some by Guns N' Roses, some by Fleetwood Mac. A lot of musicians ended up having severe drug addictions. Yeah, not great. But anyway, that was there for a reason. Drug addiction and the effects of drugs are often closely linked to neurotransmitters, especially the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. So focusing on heroin addiction is caused by a number of things, but one of the things is believed to be dopamine. So dopamine is linked with feelings of pleasure and contentment. And when heroin and other opioids are in the body, that increases the amount of dopamine that's released and how long it stays around for. And that can result in, like I've said there, short-term feelings of pleasure and contentment to a high level. Unfortunately, over time, that feeling isn't really, what's the word I'm looking for? That feeling doesn't stay with the addicts. And a lot of the time when they're injecting and taking the drugs, it's not to feel happy anymore, it's just to feel normal anymore. And that causes a really severe psychological and physiological addiction. Which is extremely difficult to break. Both psychologically, people don't want to break the habit of addiction, and the side effects can be really severe as well. So obviously, better to avoid all drugs, heroin being probably one of the most important ones to avoid out of all of them. I'll just put about MDMA here. MDMA isn't technically chemically addictive, but again, it does function based on neurotransmitters. And that works on serotonin, which is often called the happiness hormone. So what MDMA does is MDMA releases huge amounts of serotonin. Potentially it can release all of your body's reserves of serotonin that would normally use over a few days. So there's a huge release of serotonin, which does cause intense feelings of happiness as well as a number of other effects. Unfortunately, what that means, though, is because they're using their body's supply of serotonin that, like I say, would normally be released gradually over a few days and would take some time to build up. A couple of days afterwards, that can lead to feelings of severe depression and unhappiness because the body literally cannot produce serotonin for a few days as it's rebuilding it. So MDMA can, like I said, it's not technically addictive, but it can cause overdoses, and it is also very strongly linked with mental illnesses such as depression and bipolar disorder, and that's due to the natural production of serotonin, the happiness hormone, being disrupted. So yeah, better to avoid drugs in general, but that's just a bit about why heroin and MDMA can be so damaging. Okay, and finally, I've just got the last signaling molecule we're going to look at are called cytokines, not to be confused with cytokinins, which were a plant hormone. So these are signaling molecules mostly used in the immune system. And to be honest, for now, that's all I'm going to say about them. After we finish looking at signaling, and there's not too much more to look at in it, but after we finish that, we'll look at the immune system. And I figure if you just know that cytokines exist for now, and we'll look at what they actually do when we look at the immune system. Okay, that is all from me for today. Thank you.